The most powerful country in the world commands the largest economy in history, fields a military that spans every ocean, and issues the currency that underpins global trade. Yet inside this apparent dominance, you can trace patterns that historians have seen before. In the British Empire, in Imperial Spain, in earlier great powers that once believed their reach had no limits. How can a state at the center of global finance, technology, and security also exhibit warning signs that echo past superpowers on the edge of imbalance? And what does that say about the limits of power itself? To understand the United States today, you have to step back from the headlines and look at the underlying architecture. A system that has delivered extraordinary influence but also accumulated structural strains. At the core is the economic engine. By most measures, the United States remains the world's largest economy in nominal terms, with a GDP exceeding $25 trillion according to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis and international organizations like the IMF and World Bank. It leads in many high-value sectors: advanced technology, finance, pharmaceuticals, aerospace. U.S. universities dominate global rankings. American firms anchor much of the digital infrastructure of the modern world. But beneath that strength lies a balance sheet that raises questions. Public debt held by the public has climbed above 90% of GDP, and, depending on the measure, is on track to exceed 100% within the coming decade, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Total federal debt, including intragovernmental holdings, is higher still. Deficits in peacetime have become normal, not exceptional. Economists disagree on what this means. Some argue that as long as global demand for U.S. Treasury securities remains strong, and as long as the dollar maintains its reserve currency status, high debt levels are manageable. They note that interest rates, while volatile, have remained historically low for long stretches, and that advanced economies like Japan have sustained much higher debt ratios. Others warn that the combination of rising interest payments, aging populations, and political resistance to fiscal reform could squeeze out productive investment and limit future policy flexibility. The empirical evidence suggests that the relationship between debt and growth is complex and context-dependent. There is no precise threshold at which decline becomes inevitable. But the trajectory is clear. The United States is using tomorrow's resources to sustain today's commitments. Here, the first assumption begins to crack. A superpower's strength does not just come from the size of its economy, but from how much slack it has, how much margin to absorb shocks, fund wars, or tackle crises without destabilizing itself. When a state's financial system becomes the backbone of the world, its vulnerabilities can also become systemic. Overlaying this is the international role of the dollar. By most estimates from the IMF and Bank for International Settlements, around 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. A large share of global trade, including commodities priced in global markets, is conducted in the U.S. currency. This grants the United States what some scholars call exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow in its own currency at low cost, to impose financial sanctions that bite across borders, and to influence global liquidity through its central bank. But this privilege functions like a double-edged sword. The same openness and depth of U.S. capital markets that attract global savings also facilitate persistent trade deficits. For decades, the United States has imported more than it exports in goods, while exporting services, capital, and security guarantees. This pattern, analyzed in depth by economists studying global imbalances, can be sustainable for long periods, especially when the deficit country issues the reserve currency. Yet it also binds American prosperity to the confidence of foreign creditors and the stability of a financialized economy that can swing dramatically in crises, as seen in 2008. The question then emerges: what happens when the world's central pillar of finance shows signs of fiscal fatigue, while its currency still underwrites the system? To answer that, you have to look not only at balance sheets, but at the social foundation. The United States has long presented itself, and been seen by many, as an aspirational model, a society of opportunity, innovation, and pluralism. It still ranks at or near the top in many indicators of scientific output, entrepreneurial activity, and cultural influence. But credible data from government agencies, universities, and international organizations paint a more fractured internal picture. Income and wealth inequality have widened significantly since the late 20th century. Studies using U.S. Census Bureau data, as well as research by economists at major universities, show that the share of income going to the top households has increased, while median real wages for many workers have stagnated over long periods when adjusted for inflation. Intergenerational mobility, the likelihood that a child will earn more than their parents, has declined from mid-20th century levels, according to research based on tax and census records. Health indicators, particularly for certain groups, have also deteriorated. Life expectancy in the United States, which for decades trended upward, has plateaued and in some periods fallen, influenced by factors such as opioid overdoses, deaths of despair, and the uneven toll of the COVID-19 pandemic. Compared with other high-income countries, the U.S. now lags on several measures of mortality and health outcomes, despite far higher per capita health spending. At the same time, political polarization has intensified. Surveys by the Pew Research Center and major academic projects document rising effective polarization. Not just disagreement on issues, but growing animosity between partisans. Congressional voting patterns have become more ideologically sorted, with fewer moderates and more party line divisions. Trust in institutions, from federal government and media to, in some polls, science and higher education, has declined for large segments of the population. This is where historical analogies begin to surface. Scholars of empire and hegemony note that late-stage great powers often exhibit rising internal divisions, as the spoils and burdens of global primacy are distributed unevenly. Domestic cohesion weakens just as external commitments multiply. But there is disagreement on how closely the United States resembles earlier empires. Some historians argue that analogies to Rome or Victorian Britain are misleading, pointing out that the U.S. is a continental republic with democratic institutions, not a classical empire extracting tribute from colonies. Others, especially in the field of world systems analysis, emphasize structural patterns. A core state that dominates trade, finance, and security gradually faces challenges from rising powers, while its internal inequality and political fragmentation increase. The evidence supports parts of both views. The U.S. combines features of a traditional hegemon with unique institutional and technological traits. What is less disputed is the growing weight of global commitments. The United States maintains a network of alliances and bases that is unmatched. By various open-source counts, hundreds of overseas military facilities and security arrangements spanning NATO in Europe, bilateral treaties in East Asia, and partnerships in the Middle East and beyond. Defense spending, according to the U.S. Department of Defense and Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, far exceeds that of any other single country, accounting for a significant share of global military expenditures. Supporters argue that this posture has underpinned decades of relative great power peace, open sea lanes, and deterrence against major aggression. Critics, ranging from realist scholars to fiscal conservatives, counter that the U.S. faces strategic overextension, commitments in Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and the Middle East that risk stretching resources and attention, especially as competitors like China modernize their forces and Russia pursues revisionist moves in its near abroad. The U.S. has fought prolonged conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq with enormous human and financial costs, while also engaging in smaller operations and counterterrorism campaigns worldwide. Estimates by research projects at American universities and the U.S. government suggest that post-9/11 wars have cost trillions of dollars in direct spending and long-term obligations to veterans. The strategic returns of these campaigns are deeply contested. Some argue they prevented further attacks and reshaped regional politics. Others see destabilization, blowback, and opportunity costs for domestic investment. Here, another warning sign surfaces. When a superpower's military remains technologically superior, yet its political system struggles to translate force into sustainable outcomes, the credibility of power begins to erode at the margins, not necessarily in one dramatic event, but through a series of partial failures, stalemates, and ambiguous retreats. Overlay all of this with the rise of China, the persistence of Russia as a military actor, and the emergence of other regional powers, and a pattern of systemic strain emerges. The United States is still central, but no longer unchallenged in key domains: advanced manufacturing, certain technologies, regional military balances. U.S. intelligence and defense assessments themselves increasingly frame the era as one of great power competition, implicitly acknowledging that uncontested unipolarity has passed. So, what do the historical warning signs look like when you strip away metaphors and look at patterns? Studies of past hegemons, from the United Kingdom in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to earlier commercial and maritime powers, often highlight a cluster of recurring features. First, the costs of maintaining order, policing trade routes, defending allies, intervening in conflicts, rise faster than the economic returns. Second, domestic inequality and political fragmentation increase, making it harder to build consensus for either retrenchment or reform. Third, other states learn, industrialize, and catch up technologically, eroding the leader's relative edge. The British Empire, for example, entered the 20th century with global naval supremacy and vast colonial holdings. Yet it faced mounting fiscal pressures, industrial competition from the United States and Germany, and deep social conflicts at home. 2 world wars accelerated its relative decline, but the underlying trends were already visible. The mismatch between commitments and resources, between imperial ideology and domestic needs. Comparisons are imperfect. The United States benefits from scale, geography, a vast internal market, and cutting-edge innovation ecosystems. It is not managing a formal empire in the old sense. But several of the abstract dynamics apply: rising mandatory spending and interest costs crowding the federal budget, polarized politics hampering coherent long-term strategy, rivals exploiting regional opportunities while the U.S. is distracted or divided. Yet decline is not destiny. There is another tradition in political science that emphasizes adaptation over collapse. Some scholars argue that leading powers can renew themselves by reforming institutions, investing in new technologies, and renegotiating their international roles. They cite episodes like the U.S. recovery after the crises of the 1970s, stagflation, the Vietnam War, political scandal, which was followed by an economic and technological resurgence in the 1980s and 1990s. Others note how Britain, after losing formal empire, reinvented itself as a financial center and diplomatic middle power, integrated into new alliances and institutions. What determines whether a superpower adjusts or unravels is not a single metric, but its capacity to manage contradictions. In the case of the United States, that means reconciling a global security role with finite fiscal and political capital, sustaining an open, innovative economy while addressing internal dislocation, and modernizing alliances and institutions in a world where non-Western powers demand greater influence. There are signs of resilience. U.S. universities and research labs remain at the frontier of many fields, from artificial intelligence to biotechnology. Demographically, compared with other advanced economies, the U.S. has a relatively higher fertility rate and substantial immigration, which can support a larger working-age population if effectively integrated. Its energy position has shifted from heavy import dependence to significant production of oil and gas, alongside expanding renewables, giving it a more flexible base than in past decades. There are also examples of institutional self-correction. reforms after financial crises, periodic bipartisan agreements on core issues like infrastructure or basic research funding, and judicial and civil society mechanisms that can, at times, constrain abuses or force recalibrations. These elements underpin arguments by those who see the United States not in inevitable decline, but in a turbulent phase of adjustment to a more multipolar order. Still, the boundary between adjustment and erosion is thin. If debts continue to mount faster than growth, if political polarization hardens into paralysis, if social distrust deepens, and if strategic commitments are not rationalized, the ability of the United States to underwrite the existing international order will gradually weaken, not with a sudden collapse, but with incremental shifts, allies hedging, rivals probing, institutions losing effectiveness. This is where common beliefs about superpower invincibility meet their limits. Power in the contemporary world is not just measured in missiles and GDP. It rests on systems, financial architectures, alliance networks, technological standards, narratives of legitimacy. Those systems can fray even while raw capabilities remain formidable. The United States today still anchors the global order more than any other single state. But it now faces, in concentrated form, many of the warning signs that confront all hegemons over time: fiscal strain, social fragmentation, strategic overreach, and emboldened competitors. The outcome is not predetermined. Historical analogies can illuminate patterns, but they cannot dictate the future. The deeper question is not whether America falls in some dramatic sense, but how the world absorbs a gradual rebalancing, whether through cooperative adjustment, unstable rivalry, or the emergence of new forms of shared governance. The belief that any superpower is beyond decline has always been a myth, one that great states often tell themselves at the height of their influence. The real test is different. In a century defined by climate risk, technological disruption, and shifting centers of gravity, what kind of power can adapt fast enough to its own warning signs before the system it built moves on without it?